Thank you for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Melissa Keevy. I am the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. I want to thank you for attending our final panel discussion in our Dyckman Discussion Panel Series. I would like to thank our panelists, Peggy King Jorde, Rachel Watkins, Elizabeth Kennedy, and Howard Dodson for participating in this panel titled Remembering Slavery and Freedom in New York City. I would also like to thank Holy Trinity Church for hosting us today. And finally, I would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and TD Bank for sponsoring our Dyckman Discussions lecture series. To let you know a little bit about our discussion series, Dyckman Discussions is a 2-year discussion series focusing on exploring topics in New York history, such as forced removal of indigenous people, Dutch colonization, enslaved labor, and immigration. The Atlantic slave trade. Oh, we have a piece I forgot to take out of my notes. Sorry about that. In 2024, the museum will host a series of community dialogues to build on the panel discussions we've had here in 2023. And these dialogues will discuss issues that are important in today's social and political climate. We hope this project will allow members of the community to connect with each other, resulting in an even more unified community than the one that already exists today in Inwood. I will now introduce you to our panel chair, Peggy King Jorde. Peggy King Jorde is a Harvard Loeb Fellow and a principal of King Jorde Culturals, combining more than 30 years of experience in historic preservation and project planning, development, design, and management for cultural, civic, and heritage projects. King Jorde's multidisciplinary practice collaborates with marginalized communities, civic authorities, design professionals, developers, and creatives on projects for public art, cultural and sacred sites and events. Ms. King Jorde was a pivotal leading figure in the struggle to protect an African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. Later, New York Mayor David N. Dinkins named her his special advisor on the New York African Burial Ground project. She subsequently left the mayor's office to serve as the project consultant and director of memorialization, leading the design completion competition, which realized the African Burial Ground National Monument and Interpretive Center. She was a keynote presenter for the United Nations Slavery Remembrance and a recent appointee to the St. Eustatius Cultural Heritage Implementation Committee, consulting on an African burial ground preservation project on the Dutch Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. In addition to consulting on sites in Georgia, New Jersey, and the New York metropolitan area, King Jorde is a project consultant for the memorialization of the Inwood African Burial Ground and Lenape ceremonial site in New York City. There will be a chance for audience members to ask questions and engage with our speakers after they have presented. And I will now, without further ado, hand things over to Peggy King Jorde. Thank you.
I want to thank the Dyckman House Museum for actually sponsoring this important conversation and all the conversations that have happened through this season. So we're rounding it up with a really distinguished panel. I'm going to, so that I can manage expectations, I'm going to give just a brief introduction to our panelists, because I want them to really talk about who they are and how they come to this kind of work and remembrance. And I'd like for you to hear personally from them about that. And then we'll move on to various other questions. So I'll start with Elizabeth Kennedy. Elizabeth is a landscape architect and founder of EKLA. She's an expert in green infrastructure, landscape restoration, designing for cultural sites, development, and management. And I've also had the pleasure of working with Elizabeth on a project here in Inwood. And you'll hear more about Elizabeth and all the other incredible projects that she works on, and you'll be able to see a bit about that. The next panelist, Dr. Rachel Watkins. Dr. Watkins is an associate professor of anthropology at American University and a biocultural anthropologist. She is a consultant on the Inwood project and sites and projects. And Dr. Watkins primarily studies African Americans and Native Americans, and those who have historically have not been fairly represented in anthropological studies. But we're going to get into some really other heavy duty deep topics. And Rachel's work is amazing and incredibly interesting as an anthropologist, the work that she's doing. And finally, but last but not least, Dr. Howard Dodson. And Dr. Howard Dodson is a historian, educator, curator, and national leader in the movement to preserve African American history. He's the former director of the New Orleans Spingarn Research Center and director of Howard University Library System. Dr. Dodson was previous director of Harlem's Schomburg Center. And for those of you who have not been, you should go. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture for at least 27 years. So he's credited with extending the research and the reputation of that center. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Dodson. And the question that I have for all of you as panelists, first of all of you should know that the one thing that the golden thread that ties all of us is that we have a relationship with the African burial ground that was rediscovered downtown, just north of City Hall Park. So we all wore different hats and played different roles. And so I'm going to start with Dr. Dodson to kind of share more about the work that you do in general, your relationship to the African burial ground downtown, and just some general remarks about preservation and our history and New York and what your thoughts are, just in general.
That'll take a. Let me say, is this on? Can you hear me? First of all, I'm pleased to be with you this evening and pleased to have an opportunity to share the stage with such distinguished people. Hello, hello. That's better. I think you can hear better now. Okay, good. Where to start? I didn't have any intention of being in this particular sphere of social political activity. I don't, to be perfectly honest, I'm not particularly comfortable around the dead. But when the burial ground was discovered down in Lower Manhattan, I got a call from Mayor Dinkins' office asking, actually I was initially called by a group of the, I guess, what was our term for them? The descendants. The descendants asking to, if I could do anything to try to protect the burial ground. And at the time, I didn't have any formal relationship with the city in this particular area. I eventually was called by Mayor David Dinkins, and he asked me to head up a group to advise the Park Service on the memorialization and protection of the burial ground there. Among the things that I ended up doing was chairing the committee that was established by the was the National Park, yeah, the National Park Service to provide advice and consultation to the contractors and others, and in terms of making decisions about both issues of preservation and curation. And I served for, I think I signed up for about 2 or 3 months to chair this committee before it met with the Park Service people. And I ended up spending 17 years working on the burial ground with a full-time job at the Schomburg Center. What became interesting, why it became interesting to me though, was that I am trained as a historian, and one of my areas of study is on the enslaved African experience in this hemisphere. And the burial ground turned out to be certainly the largest public conversation about slavery, probably in the United States at the time. There wasn't very much going on, even in the classroom. It was just something that you skipped over or tried to avoid, or and in other settings where the topic of slavery might come up, it was the topic that you tried to get through as quickly as possible. Among Black folk, there was always a certain dis-ease about talking about the subject, especially in mixed company, because you never knew what the others thought about you. And among the white folk, they usually would go off feeling guilty about the heritage that they're part of, the roots of. And so until the burial ground actually hit and became news, people were not talking about slavery and the slave experience in the United States very much at all. And part of the reason had to do with the way that slavery was being taught in schools at the time. If you recall, and it probably hasn't changed in your case, basically slavery was something in the South, something that happened in the South. And the good folk in the North, especially those in New York, were those who basically became a part of the leaders of the abolitionist movement. And so those who were in the abolitionist movement basically were the good guys, and those who were in the South running plantations, etc., were viewed as those who were the perpetrators of these sins. Or if you're one, can you hear me?
Gotta hold it up to your mouth, yeah. Yeah,
Okay, I'll try again.
yeah. But you know what, Howard, quick question, just to elaborate before we get on to Rachel. Yeah, people did think of, once the burial ground became this, the African burial ground was the topic. And everybody, something that kept getting repeated was that, hey, I thought this was a Southern construct, not a Northern construct. So, but since that time, as people, and the records have always been there. I mean, you headed up the Schomburg. So what was the reality of that history? Part of the reality of the history, like you talked about, the relationship was that the good guys were in the North, and the abolitionists, and that was kind of the myth. Mm-hmm. But in fact, New York as the financial center, right? Can you talk a little bit about, just a tiny bit about that?
Very briefly.
Hold it up, so
New York, initially, as you perhaps know, was colonized by the Dutch, and they set up the community in Lower Manhattan, and actually had a little bit going on in Harlem, but not very much, in what is today's Harlem. But what they set up in Lower Manhattan they did it with slave labor. Virtually all of the public facilities, all of the work with laboring, with farming, everything that had to do with constructing houses and constructing roads between Lower Manhattan and Upper Manhattan. All of that was done by slave labor. It was a different kind of slavery from what came out of the British, in that there was some sense, it wasn't as fixed in law, first of all. And second, they did not expect to be enslaved forever. You had to do a period of time in slavery, but in contrast to the British colony, many individuals who were Black individuals who were enslaved in the first instance came out of slavery as property owners and as free people, and working in a pretty broad sweep of industries and activities. And so it wasn't at that time a kind of locked closed system, and people spent their period of time, came out and started building their independent lives. The thing that facilitated them being able to do that was that the people who were the colonists needed a buffer between themselves and their colony and the indigenous population. And so the area around, what's two or three of the first tier of communities.
Like Greenwich Village.
Greenwich Village, yeah. 5 Points, all of that area, virtually all of that area by the time that the Dutch tenure ended, belonged to Black folk, former enslaved people. But it wasn't pure charity. It was to be part of the protection from them, for them. The Dutch come in, the British come in 1664. They come in with a boatload of enslaved Africans, basically end up convincing the Dutch that they couldn't win a war, and then negotiating a peace between themselves and the Dutch, the English and the Dutch, with the Dutch getting from England Suriname, and the British getting New York. And so that introduces a whole new thing, because the British have a very fixed system of slavery and slavery for life, et cetera. And so it's put in place.
Okay.
I'll
Thank you.
say some more.
Rachel, how do you come to this work? What's your relationship to New York? New York's legacy?
Yes, it's grown over time. So I think So one of the words that I want to repeat, I'm going to have, as my great grandmother would say, on repeat and repeat, is undisciplined. Because it's an important term that I think is very important to the New York African Burial Ground, as well as the Inwood Sacred Sites Project. I wanted to, oh, thank you. So I can see it. So this is a picture from around 1995, I believe, 1994, 1995. So roughly 30 years ago. So I was not 51 like I am now. And the picture includes Michael Blakey, the scientific director for the project, the late Mark Mack, who was the laboratory director for the project, and all of the research team that had the privilege of examining and studying and caring for the ancestral remains that came from the Lower Manhattan, New York African Burial Ground. And I say that now because over time, one of the important legacies of the New York African Burial Ground project is that there are so many throughout the city. It was very fitting for the New York African Burial Ground project to be located, or the research segment of it to be located at Howard in the William Montague Cobb Laboratory for a number of reasons. William Montague Cobb was the first African-American to get a doctorate in biological anthropology, and throughout his career, in addition to being a health activist, an instructor in anatomy for Howard's Medical School, he conducted research emphasizing the connection between biology and culture. So think about the focus of the New York African Burial Ground project, kind of looking at the biological consequences of enslavement. William Montague Cobb was doing this work back in the 1930s, when the majority of scholars in biological anthropology were focused on racial typology, coming up with so-called differences in the shape of the skeleton and bodily functions and all these things between different racial groups. So Cobb was someone who was very undisciplined and ahead of his time in terms of how he went about scientific practices.
That's very disciplined.
All right, we're gonna talk about
Wasn't trapped in a discipline.
That's right, not trapped in a discipline. But, you know, at the time, his work was considered to be not as rigorous as traditional scientists. And in keeping with that legacy, at the time that the New York African Burial Ground happened, it was not considered to be scientifically rigorous. Why? Because it was interdisciplinary in focus. So it had that focus on connecting biology to culture. There were also historians involved, geneticists, art historians, so that every aspect of the site and these people's experiences could be highlighted. Most importantly, and at the time, scientists thought the least rigorous component of the project was its ethical epistemology, which focused on generating scientific knowledge with the descendant community. So the descendant community had a hand in coming up with research questions. Their recommendations guided how we conducted research in the laboratory. And it was very transformative because it was their questions and their accountability that made the project as far-reaching as it is.
And that's really, I cannot tell you how important that was.
Okay.
I didn't know how important that was at the time.
Yeah.
Because my regard to anthropologists and archaeologists was that, you know, it's like going to the doctor. Whatever the doctor tells you, you're going to follow the rules. And what I learned is that the work, and maybe you can explain that a little more, that archaeology is an interpretive science. So depending upon who's handling the bones, how much they know, all of that, they get to write and tell the stories. So the African Burial Ground, the work that you all were doing downtown, really was enlightening, because you did reach out to the community. You did engage the community in a way to have them ask and raise the questions to say, this is what we want to learn.
Just a slight correction. The community
I was
engaged.
They
couldn't do anything without getting the approval.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I don't know of too many archaeological projects that run that way. Even many of the efforts in Native American communities, they just run roughshod over that principle.
Right.
I mean, we really can't be following them because they don't know. Well, they do know.
Right.
And any of it.
And a lot of, and then what was, so I mean, what you said about that was so incredibly important, and part of facilitating that as well, aside from the community coming out through general activism. I always say that there was activism on the outside and there was activism because I was on the inside, coloring outside of the lines, risking your job. You're not sure whether somebody's gonna, boot you out. But part of facilitating that community as well, there were different forms, but through the Schomburg Center meetings that happened there, where we had open mic, everybody was permitted to come to the mic and talk about what it was that was important to them as a community or as individuals. So I appreciate.
Right, and people self-identified as descendants of the ancestors who were buried at the site and demanded they be recognized as such. And that's where the accountability of so many folks comes into play, or them holding so many of us accountable based on our roles in the project. I want to highlight specifically that the term enslavement that we now use in place of slavery came from the descendant community and holding us accountable to recognizing the identity of these enslaved persons beyond that institution. They also wanted us to make sure to refer to these ancestors as enslaved Africans, again, not limiting the historical scope or their identity by even their time in the United States. The research questions that they required of us made the project richer. They're the reason why the project had a focus on examining the lives of these people who represented being on the cusp of African-American identity based on the timing. And again, the reason why this was something that did not seem to be undisciplined on the part of Michael Blakey as a scientific researcher and the other lead scientists is because we were all embedded in this tradition of African descendant scholar activism that did not recognize these disciplinary boundaries and kind of operated with an understanding of how these things fit together. And again, that makes sense because if you're talking about racialized people, right, whose identities are often imposed or people attempt to impose an identity on us, these are folks who understand that you can't compartmentalize aspects of your life, in terms of academic work, life work, what have you, because so much of that work that we're doing involves what I call this very sophisticated, political, artistic endeavor of theorizing yourself into humanity. You're not being thought of as a human being. So we brought all of that with us to that project. And many of us, the folks in the pictures there, have gone on to get their doctorates with a really strong focus on a biocultural orientation. So, the legacy of the New York African Burial Ground has yet to be fully understood based on the work that's going on now on the part of myself, Joseph Jones, and the students that we're currently training. And also, unfortunately, some of the people, as I mentioned in the picture, not just Mark, are now with the ancestors, their ancestors, and that's continuing to kind of shape how we think about how we want to continue to interpret the project and kind of explore the ways in which it can inform work now and in the future.
Thank you. Finally, Elizabeth.
Well, let me just explain right off the bat, I'm not a scholar. I don't have a PhD.
Don't
That's
hold that
the
against yourself.
discipline. That's the
I'm a
discipline.
landscape architect, and I came to this work, I want to say by accident and misadventure. I've known Peggy for, I think more than 20 years now, but she was not my first foray into this work. I actually came to work specifically in African-American cultural spaces because of the Weeksville Heritage Center. And if those of you who have not been to Weeksville, it's worth a trip. It's easily accessed by subway, and you will get lost in the story there over and over and over again. And I even came to Weeksville I like to say that I was called to that project. I am, first of all, I should explain that I am the daughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation American. My ancestral background is Afro-Caribbean. But we lived on Bergen Street. We lived several blocks from the Hunter Fly Road houses. And when I told my mother that I was going to be working on this project, she said, those houses are still standing. I'm like, yeah, they're still standing, right? But I was asked to be on that project because, in case you haven't noticed, I'm a woman of African descent, and the policy of procurement in the public sector means that they have participation goals, and there was no other qualification to be on this project. And in fact, when the architect won the project, they said, well, you've never done this kind of work before, so all you have to do is show up at the meetings. So I said, well, okay, I'll go to the meetings. And Weeksville was a very romantic project. People, first of all, it's really important to understand that the houses are where they've always been. And so the fact that
Which is since when?
the earliest is dated to 1830, but that's not the earliest in the community. And Dr. Dotson is very impatient, so I'll try and get to the punchline. But what I mean by that is okay, that I wanted to first give the mechanics of the story, right? Because in sitting in these meetings, and a lot of people had there would be 20, 30, 40 people in a room. Everybody had an idea about what the restoration of the Hunter Fly Road houses needed to be, what the new education center needed to be. And I would sit there and I would say, you know, you're really talking about X. And if you go down that route, then this is what's going to happen. If you're really talking about Y, and you need to think about this in this way. And when they fired that architect and hired a new architect, they said, well, you know, could you keep Elizabeth on it? And it turned out that I knew the second architect. And they said, we love Elizabeth. So I've been on Weeksville for almost 28 years, right? Now, I knew that New York was a slave state because Weeksville was formed as one of several communities after slavery was ostensibly fully ended in New York State in 1827. Now, we celebrate Juneteenth today, but I'm here to tell you that there were people enslaved in Coney Island almost at the turn of the 20th century because the news had not migrated south. Coney Island. Okay, so the whole institution of enslavement and the transition to freedom and what that meant in terms of land economics as a landscape architect is really interesting to me because, among other things, Brooklyn and Queens were transformed immediately from large sort of dairy farms to vegetable farms because suddenly there wasn't the labor or the incentive to maintain these open tracts of land. And out of that, you then had the formation of these small communities, these small Weeksvilles all over the place, Sandy Ground on Staten Island, right? Places in Queens, all the way out on Long Island, where the formerly enslaved and the long free were able to buy land through education, through developing internal capacity and form these communities and building wealth. And what's interesting about Weeksville is that it's what's called off-grid. You can actually see the historical pattern of that change on that site as part of the design, but also part of the historic fabric and evidence that's there. Okay, I refer to Weeksville as the project that keeps on giving because on the basis of working on that project, Rodney Leon, who had won the competition, the design competition for the burial ground, asked me to be on his team. And I felt, first of all, in working with Weeksville and then coming to the burial ground, Peggy and we'll get into the debate that we often have, but I'm not a landscape architect that working in the cultural space. I don't really work with symbolism. But what I try to do in our landscape design is just create a context by which people can imagine what this felt like 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 150 years ago. And there's some very specific design things that I do to make that happen. So when we got to the burial ground and looking at the history, and you understood that beyond Wall Street was the land of the Blacks, which was the buffer between the colonial Dutch community and the very annoyed Lenape community to the north, right? That an area that had once been pristine and is treated by New York City Parks Department as pristine, over time became a place of marginalized and forgotten land. And in that marginalization, it was then used for burial and interment. So it became sacred despite its marginalization. And this was the Collect Pond was a very large area. And so when we come to the African Burial Ground National Monument site, and we see this postage stamp, for me, the issue was, how do we make the visitor understand what it felt like to be on the shores of the Collect Pond, giving last rites to a loved one? And we had a very narrow slice of land in which to do this, because the remains are being returned to the site in 7 sarcophagi that were carved in Ghana. And I knew from work that Weeksville also brought to my attention, because we were working with the Hebrew Free Burial Society on its historic cemetery on Staten Island, about the collapse over time of grave sites. You know, okay. And I knew that over time, there would be collapse at the site, at the interment site. And so I said, okay, this is the one opportunity where somebody's going to get what the Collect Pond was, by designing the mounds to anticipate the eventual collapse. And when I told Peggy that, she said, Elizabeth, nobody's going to get that. Nobody's going to understand that. And she broke my heart. But it goes to the power of the sense of earth. This is what I really want to, I've been taking this a long time to say, but we are connected by the earth, and this will come up again in the conversation, and how that is a very direct and emotionally simple, accessible way of conveying the importance of these stories, whether or not it's living communities or it's the ancestral community as its remains are here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I just want to check our time. Okay, all right. So, because the next question that I have, I know we could probably carry this on until midnight, but we're gonna keep it tight before we sort of move into talking about Inwood's own African burial ground and what's happening at that site. But before we do that, I just want some remarks, but I know this may last, but you can all jump in whenever. I'll hand my mic over. Given what has happened in Florida, and when we talk about how history is being taught or not taught, statements like slavery benefited.
You won't have any time.
We have to get there. We have to get the topic. Slavery benefiting African Americans. So thinking about that, and my question is the importance and the potential for impact of memorialization and commemoration of memory. So we've got a problem, you know, and where do we think we need to be when we talk about commemoration, memorialization? I mean, what's the response? And take 2 minutes. Okay, each 2 minutes.
Does anybody want to go first? Because I can.
There won't be any time left.
You know, we live in a country where there's signs everywhere that says George Washington slept here. And that's understood as important. And even if you are an immigrant to the country, you soon know who George Washington was and why this was important. Our story, our narrative, our commemoration has to be woven into the daily fabric of our lives. Dr. Dotson said, you know, at one point in time, people avoided the conversation of slavery. I grew up in a household where there was a discomfort with being associated with
Slaves.
The enslaved and people who were not too far removed from that condition, right? So this embrace of the narrative on a big scale is relatively new. It comes out of the work of the African Burial Ground, but it also comes out of the work of just the groundswell of scholarship, I would say, that is being recognized in ways different than certainly when my parents were in studying when I was in college, right? So we have to get to a point where this understanding is as normalized as anything else, is not taken for granted, right? And it is understood in its ubiquity. That's really what our work has to be to counter the nonsensical narrative that is not new, but in my opinion, dates back specifically, particularly 40 years ago. So we are countering generations of erosion of a type of narrative across the board, while the world is being able to recognize the dignity and the essence and the richness of stories, not just in our community, but globally, of people who have otherwise been invisible in the narrative. So this is our time.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just quickly highlight that I see the discourse that's, you know, taking place in Florida and elsewhere. The slavery wasn't, you know, so bad discourse that's going on. I see a connection between that discourse and the discourse around slavery being very regionally specific. Before the New York African Burial Ground brought that to light. And so I think it is important, to Elizabeth's point, to keep in mind how these things are connected, because there's a way in which certain ways of talking about things are kind of presented, I would say rhetorically, you know, in a way to convince people that it's new, you know, or where did this come from? This is ridiculous. When really it's part of a continuum that this country, you know, a continuum about this country's struggle with really recognizing the existence of enslavement, the inhumanity and violence of enslavement, and the enduring legacy of enslavement. So I think those of us who are resourced and able to make these connections, we have an obligation to do that, because making those connections brings to light the different ways of thinking that might be cloaked or people aren't seeing very readily. And without seeing those ideas, without bringing them to light, without naming them, we can't counter them.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm going to share a few demographic things with you, and then want to move in a little bit more on this. Between 1492 and 1776, or roughly the first 300 years of the colonization of the Americas, 6.5 million people crossed the Atlantic and settled in the Americas, North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. Of those 6.5 million people, only 1 million were European. The other 5.5 million were African. Point number one. Point number two, New York developed differently from the southern states and from the rest of this, basically the Caribbean South. In that the crops that were working as an economic base were crops that basically that came from tropical kinds of climates. They had farms and plantations here doing foods and other kinds of things, but turning that into a global economy was not realistic based on what's in the greater New York and northern region. That notwithstanding, New York really moved to the center, the British actually moved to the center of the slave trade enterprise after they ran the Dutch out of here. And New York was the epicenter of the slave trade, as well as the products produced by enslaved Africans being sold in Europe and every place else in the world. Said another way, the people of New York, the bankers, the mayors, the businessmen, the marketers, the commercial element, all were at the center of this trading and producing for goods for the marketplace for the 300 or so years of the slave trade. So just as an example, one of the things in 1900, there were still only 6,000 people of African descent living in New York City. 60,000. That's partially because of that 6.5 million that came from over to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere. Only 500,000 of them over the full course of slavery ended up being sold in the United States. What is the United States? 500,000 out of what turned out to be 10 million. Only 500,000 of the 10 million ended up here. But the people who were here, the whites who were here, were actually organized and ran this international system of both agricultural production, as well as sugar and liquor, rum, etc. All of those things turned out to be the economic foundations of both the United States and the whole of the Western Hemisphere. All of it done with slave labor, and most of the enslaved population that's working are not in the United States, but the ships are being organized and run from New York. The distilleries, anybody familiar with diamond sugar?
Domino sugar.
Domino sugar.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Domino sugar was over there, I think right in Brooklyn. And that's where they processed the sugar to make it granulated and all the rest of that. But they were also producing rum, which was being put on the boat and shipped to Europe to be sold in the marketplace in Europe. And so the economic activity that came out of basically the European capture and exploitation of the peoples and land of the Americas ultimately went into this new global economy and supported it until it came to an end. All of that is to say that we don't, let me say, if you don't talk about the slavery, you don't know very much about the history.
Right.
That's for everybody.
Yeah.
If you don't talk about the slavery, if you don't understand the slavery, you don't know anything really about the history.
Right.
And I'll stop there because.
Thank you.
What was the thing we were talking about before?
No, just the Florida.
Oh, the Florida thing. I'll be very brief on that. First of all, the governor has a history degree. The governor has a law degree from Yale. And he has a PhD. And he's the most ignorant man in the world about American history. And I mean, his position, quite frankly, is that you shouldn't teach anybody anything that upsets the young people. Well, you shouldn't commit the acts that creates the upset. And you should be working to be sure that they never happen again. And you learn how not to do it by reviewing what happened. And you can't lie to yourself about what you're learning. Now, if that disturbs you, that you have a problem.
Right.
But, and he aspires to be our president, excuse me.
The other thing that I would add, and then I'm going to cue our film, is that talking about something else that, and we've all talked about it, and that is recognizing the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as a global construct. And as you talked about, you know, if you go to business school, this is the kind of stuff you want to, you know, if you just follow the money, let's just say we won't even talk about race, just follow the money and what the trade was. That alone will tell you the history of this country and so many other countries. And
Basically, the whole Western Hemisphere.
Right. So that alone, just go to business school.
So much of what Elizabeth shared made me think about the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. I encourage everybody
Yes.
to go see it because it lays what we're talking
Yes,
about
absolutely.
out beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. So all this leads up to part of this conversation, or the heart of this conversation leads up to Inwoods. And I wonder, is everybody here who's here, do you live in Inwood? Do you live in the area locally? Kind of, sort of, maybe not, kind of. Okay, but you have an African burial ground here. And so we're going to share a brief documentary film about the site. That's just nearby on 10th Avenue, and I think it's 212. 212. Yeah, that's being developed.
I always say that this was a project in the making for probably a little over 30 years.
Sculpture, and then the doors here into the
sacred space, the internal
space. That site, right, if you looked at it, was an auto body shop. It was an open lot and a one-story tin garage with some hydraulic lifts. That's what we were buying. What we learned was that long before that, hundreds of years before that, the site had been a burial ground for enslaved people. And even before that, it had been a spiritual site for the Lenape people who lived here first. I didn't know what we could do and what we should do at Inwood, but I had a feeling Peggy might have a good idea.
I met Muzzy when I joined the Mayor's Office of Construction. This would have been, I guess, 1991. It was brought to my attention through an environmental impact statement, a document that gets compiled when you want to build a building. It tells you how the site was used over the course of time. And in looking at that document, I became aware of the fact that there was this African burial ground, and it was within 2 blocks of City Hall. As this project grows, members in my office, including Muzzy, begin to sort of hear that I'm working on this project, writing about what we should be doing on a project that I was not supposed to be working on. I would color outside of the lines, and I would stay late because my boss was away, the boss for Muzzy and myself. And I could generate these letters and these memos that really called into question a federal agency that intended to build a $500 million project. And one night Muzzy was there, and he came over, and I remember him saying, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. We're the mayor's office of construction, and construction is good. It means jobs, it means all these important things. Well, I thought, I have heard him talk about giving tours of the Lower East Side and this history that was so important to him and his community. And I said, you know, Muzzy, if you were confronted on one of your project sites with members of the Jewish community, would you have another response? And that sparked a conversation between us. And it was an important conversation and a pivotal conversation, I think. At some point, Muzzy did say, yeah, I guess you're right. I would have difficulty facing my community and saying, no, you know, we're going to move forward and forget the resource. Fast forward years later, Muzzy calls me about the BRC Inwood site.
Right, so like where we're standing right now, we're like standing on this fence. And I called Peggy, and I began to reveal what was happening at Inwood. And she got extremely excited. I got extremely excited. But through it all, it was, you know, Peggy and I just kind of talking about this incredible discovery. We didn't know what the answer was, but we knew it wasn't running away. In our roots, in our values as an organization, I think we felt a connection to that history. The opportunity to honor the site, honor the history, honor the people who had been buried there, and find a way to do it that might also recognize that the traumas and indignities that the enslaved people who had been buried there had lived with are similar traumas and indignities that the people we serve at BRC, overwhelmingly people of color. That historical narrative and that present day narrative had a connection.
It's always sort of been known, but it was actually made a little better known when the IRT started digging up 10th Avenue and leveling it in order to build a subway. That's in 1903, they were working on it here. They were grading a lot of streets in the neighborhood at that time.
That graveyard was used by the Dyckman family and the Nagel family, both families that came here from the Netherlands. They were both living in this area, which was quite rural. There weren't a lot of people living in this area. And we know that at some point the Dyckman and Nagel families intermarried. And so they used that burial ground to bury enslaved people.
The scientists from the American Museum of Natural History took, I think, 4 skulls back to the museum. And there were a couple of other people, a newspaper editor or a newspaper reporter, and a sort of an avocational historian, I think donated a couple more sets. So there were maybe 4 or 5 or 6 sets of remains or partial remains at the Museum of Natural History.
I think I told Muzzy at the time, I said, I don't see how I can personally be involved in building on a burial ground. For my personal values, my ancestors, my history. And he respected that. He understood where I was coming from. And so it was strategizing and figuring out how we could do these things, and obviously reaching out to Peggy. I think it was engaging Peggy, right? It was Muzzy calling up that relationship, that long relationship that he had with her, and the fact that she has the history and knows what this is about and knows what it means to build. And also hearing from her that we've been here before, what the path forward can look like.
What's important about that site is what people are doing with it. You know, that instead of treating it as private property, you know, technically they can do whatever they want. You know, and instead of doing that, thinking about how this site fits into history, not just for African Americans, but also Native Americans, and understanding, you know, kind of fundamentally that the past is connected to the present in ways that require acknowledging it in some way.
Historically, there were over 25 to 26 Lenape village sites here on the island. So it was an important place for families and communities living and thriving in an environment that was in perfect sync and harmony with all the seasons and all the aspects of nature.
We excavated 5 trenches on the project site, and we were able to confirm there's no evidence that the upper soils that contain the cemetery and that contain the indigenous site are still present. I've never worked on a site where a developer was so invested in acknowledging a site's past and rectifying some of the wrongs that have happened with respect to the disturbance of a burial. BRC really went above and beyond to both acknowledge and document the site and its history, as well as to engage the community, both people living here now, people of African descent, people of indigenous descent, working with everyone to reclaim the site and rename it and re-acknowledge its past and its history and its importance.
They knew the importance of a relationship, not just a transaction, you know. Fill out this form, here's some questions, let's get through this, snap, snap, snap. It was a conversation that evolved over time. It's really well done.
We know what a burial ground is for. It's for us to be able to reconnect. It's for us to be able to find healing, to find support, to find strength, to be empowered. And for those who are amongst us who are battling with homelessness, those amongst us who are battling with being able to provide for their basic needs, things that we take for granted, what better place to do so? What better place to heal and recover than a space that was originally dedicated and committed to spiritual upliftment?
There was really very much intrigue about being a part of the process. They asked us. They're asking us what's next. So I think people were really, they loved that. They loved having that connection to understanding what the rest of that story was going to be and understanding that their voice would be considered in what that story would be.
It was kind of a blessing kind of feeling that I could be just a tiny part of something this great, because it's an opportunity. You know, it's a real opportunity for a community to recognize what it was. This site is right next to a school, but the school seemed to be all right with it. In fact, there was a ceremony where the school acknowledged the memorial was coming and talked about it, and I thought that was just wonderful. And now people are trying to cover up and to make believe that racism and slavery and all of that didn't happen, and it didn't happen right here, and not just in the South, but right here. I just felt honored to be a small part of it.
This could all have been done through a city agency, and it would have totally gone up in flames, because they would just say, oh, the city wants housing to go here. They didn't really listen or whatever. The community had to walk away feeling they were heard. And if you would look back on it, everyone's voice added something to advancing the bigger possibility, because all of us gave something to each other.
From a designer's perspective, the idea of the ground plane is really important, because that's the element that unifies the exterior and the interior. One of the things that we did was to actually make the act of descending to the courtyard ceremonial. The idea of descending and then opening up into the Lenape form addressed the opportunity for reinterment or commemoration.
You see an organization whose one intent is to serve people. That's it, is serve people who don't have housing, serve people who have no voice. And then they find out what was on that land, what had happened to that land. And this is how I believe something spiritual is going on. Because in Inwood, where the voiceless, represented by those who are without housing, are being served by BRC, I think that connector from those people from centuries ago reached out, and they found receptors in Muzzy and in Peggy, two giants, I believe, two people whose hearts somehow are filled with grace, and their own very distinct heritages made them open to being able to recognize they were doing something far beyond themselves.
What's so inspiring about doing this work with Peggy is the thoughtfulness and the creativity that she brings to it.
People are talking now today about reparative justice and what does that look like? And it looks like what BRC is doing. That's what it looks like. BRC's desire to reclaim humanity, whether it's historically or contemporarily, that is what we ought to be doing.
She's shown, not just through words, but through actions, that we can embrace our history, we can own our history, we can talk about our history, as traumatic as it is. We can talk about race. We can talk about slavery. We can talk about trauma. And do it in a way that heals. Do it in a way that's truly inclusive. And do it in a way that builds a better future.
Consistent with what the community has spoken about, what they desire, what they want to do at the site. My vision is to have the repatriation of the remains that are at the Museum of Natural History, the remains to come back to the site that they were ripped from and to be laid to rest. In a perfect world, that's exactly what I would want to see. This project isn't complete until that happens.
And then quick question to everybody, and then we want to sort of land on some more visuals, the design. But how this project is happening, you have a situation where you have a developer who comes, and it happens to be an organization that's a nonprofit that develops housing, affordable housing, shelters in the city of New York. They recognize their clientele are primarily Black and brown people. Black and brown people who are generally marginalized in communities, because most communities don't want shelters in their communities. And they encountered this site. And this was about 3 years ago. And so for them, tapping into the site, they were prepared to walk away. But they were not prepared to walk away and leave the site to possibly other people who may not just even make that connection historically. And so there were a series of collaborations with the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum as a cultural institution, recognizing that the land had belonged to the Dyckman and Nagel families, that these were individuals who had been enslaved by those families, also connecting with, doing extensive community outreach, all of those things. So project, everyone here with the exception of Dr. Dodson has something to do with that project. One quick question, how important, given the history of the African burial ground downtown, what we've talked about earlier, how significant are these collaborations to projects like this, to sites like this that have this kind of significance?
One of the things that I've been thinking about throughout this conversation, and certainly during the film, is how The New York African Burial Ground brought together different constituencies of people in a research project who usually are not brought together or allowed to even convene and be part of a project together. And so I see what BRC is doing as an important continuation of that in terms of them electing to kind of subject themselves to Section 106. They did not have to do that. Many people still still draw upon the fact that they own private property, that the property is not tied to the government, to do whatever they want with whatever they find on their property. So the idea that, the fact that they were compelled to do that, of course, and it makes sense because of these connections, that's why it happened. So, I mean, I think these connections are essential and they have impact that we don't even immediately see right away. Who thought that what happened at the New York African Burial Ground would grow into something like what's happening at BRC? Another thing I wanted to mention that's very important is representation, because you mentioned that you kind of came to the Weeksville project by happenstance, and that the plan was for you to just be there as a token of representation, as opposed to playing a pivotal role in the project. And we see that without you, there would have been a huge loss. The project wouldn't be what it is. What Peggy did, the reason why I'm a part of the project has to do with an outgrowth of intentional representation being brought into this project. Some of you might be aware that in the field of archaeology, the majority of the research in the US is conducted on African descendant sites that are largely or predominantly researched by people who are not African American. Luckily, there is a small but growing number of African descendant archaeologists who are turning the tide, but that's the way that it is. So it's often the case that on a project of this sort, you're not going to be able to find, not only are you not going to be able to find an African descendant archaeologist, it's guaranteed that it's going to be a white archaeologist. And so Peggy had the foresight to see, you know what, knowing what I know from the 30 plus years I've been doing this, that is not going to fly. There needs to be some representation. And in bringing me in, she demonstrated that the representation isn't just about presence, which is what you demonstrated all those years ago, that there is a vision and intelligence that we have that's essential, really, to these projects. So I worked with the archaeologist with doing the initial investigation of the site and kind of acting as a liaison between BRC and the archaeologists and the descendant community and the archaeologists. So it was a matter of me drawing on my expertise to contribute to the project. So I think that's really, really important to say, because we often think about representation in really hollow ways that belie the impact in the immediate and long term.
Great. No,
Nothing to add, no.
oh, okay. Well, you're gonna give us, I'm gonna hand this over to you. We're gonna, because our time is getting short, but all yours, Elizabeth.
Okay,
We're gonna take it to the next level.
I'm happy to.
Let me just do one thing.
Yeah.
And it fits here rather than later.
Okay. Do you need the mic? You need the mic.
While I was working on the African Burial Grounds, a major initiative was launched at the United Nations to basically to do memorialization of heritage sites of people of African descent here and in other parts of the world. And it turned out to be like a 20-year project too, because we're doing site surveys, but also going, I said, the record of whatever goes on here is in Europe, in the archives in Europe. And we ended up sending people to Europe to try to track down, to discover what was there. And there's still efforts going on to try to have some of those a significant portion of those records made accessible to. This is the context, and this is in the post-colonial period. And people are basically reorganizing their society, but the records of what transpired for most of the colonial period are in Europe.
Yeah.
Even though you live in the Caribbean or you live in Brazil or here.
Right.
And so trying to take advantage of some of this new consciousness to put people in touch with that critical part of these distinctive people's heritage that was interrupted, but fortunately better documented than they even know.
Right.
So that those histories can be reconstructed. And there have been programs sponsored by the governments of the Caribbean and basically to create memorializations and other kinds of things to give presence and meaning to that experience in these various countries.
Thank you.
Well, for those of you who are watching at home, and this one's better. Okay, great. We will not concentrate on Weeksville today, but I just wanted to add to this conversation the pivot within commemoration work to Black joy. And how important that is to recognize and to celebrate and commemorate as well as the full complement of Black life. So we'll scroll ahead because Peggy's wonderful film actually touched on a lot of what I had to say because some of them were my graphics. But very simply to touch on this again, we can see that immediately in this vicinity, there were signs of both Lenape and African presence here. And it's interesting because any fourth grader who goes to school in New York kind of knows that the Lenape were in Inwood, and the whole aspect of coming to the only remaining primeval forest in the city and looking for the caves and evidence of that life in a sort of romanticized way that is a European narrative rather than a Lenape narrative. But in this instance now where the science and the investigation now brings more truthful context to the story. So just a few blocks from here is the site. If you go to the next slide. And just to give it some context, that's the 10th Avenue, that's the L along the number 1 L along 10th Avenue. The site in solid red, that little box is the current map of those interments. And the dashed line was the burial ground for the enslaving families on that location. Next slide. And so in BRC's recognition of the significance of the story, not just of the story, but the significance of the story and its site development approach, the area with, again, the red box is the portion of the new building, the new shelter building that is dedicated to commemoration and interpretation of this history. Next slide. And as you can see, it's quite small. In the very beginning, Peggy first invited, I didn't realize it was an interview, but she, we spoke about the caliber of museums and the quality of the experience of small spaces and how that is so important to the understanding, again, of the significance of the site. And I was charged with the responsibility of bringing together a group of professionals. And so I I brought to BRC's attention a range of architects and artists of African descent. And BRC went with Mark Gardner of Jackish Gardner and Christy Cornelius of Studio Indigenous. So we had two architects with cultural focus working on this project that might be a quarter the size of this room and me. So we were convening, but there were certain technical challenges. We had a small space, we had an even smaller outdoor courtyard. We had the project is located on a site that has a slope. And so with that, we have different sort of elevations of which we have to just navigate from a functional standpoint. And we decided to take those constraints as an opportunity for storytelling. And so one of the things we looked at was in having to descend into the space that was being saved for this commemoration, whether or not we could then explore further the spatial aspects of experiencing the context of interment. And so whereas originally we were supposed to go down 3.5 feet, we tried to push it to 6. Because as we know, 6 feet under is the narrative of where you place remains in the northeast in order to not have them disturbed with freeze thaw. That's a sort of geological process that's involved here. So that ramping that you see in this image shows a sort of processional approach to this lower area, so that when you first entered and then when you got to the lower space, there was a whole aspect of approaching the story. So if you look at the next slide, Carolyn, you can see that in this diagram, we were doing a very physical, we were forcing the view down so that for that concept, when you came into the space, you couldn't see straight ahead. You had to look down. And you couldn't see light directly. You had to see that it was beyond your view. So the next slide. And so just generally what that was experientially, you saw that you had the whole idea that also the ceiling was also low and above your head and bringing you and changing the way you relate ordinarily to architectural space. So the next slide. In the meantime, the design trio, I'll call it that, began to look at actually material aspects of culture. So with Joe Baker's assistance and Peggy's assistance, we looked at Lenape forms of ornamentation on garments in particular. This represents a lot of what Joe Baker's work himself. So the next slide as well. And the importance of beadwork. And actually, Mark decided that beadwork was one of the material aspects that were shared between the culture and would be, it provided an opportunity to look at how ornamentation between the two cultures can actually be thematically linked. That was one of the reasons why he was focused on that. Next slide. And with that sort of textural approach, he then began to look at the materiality of how the ceiling could be approached, how the floor could be approached, how texturing the sort of spatial envelope actually changed the way this felt against your skin, actually, how you begin to interpret the story through this sort of physicality that came from this materiality. Next slide. Again, this is the bandolier pattern that Chris began to focus on more specifically. The image on the right is one of Joe's art pieces. The image on the left is a child's garment. These are Lenape pieces. And in abstracting this pattern, Chris was looking at how this sort of graphic idea then became translated into another, like a construction material, and in this instance, very thin steel plate. So when you look at his sculpture, next slide, and his initial studies, first of all, he worked with Joe on a form that, on Joe's advice, began to capture the embrace of Lenape culture and how that really sort of dominated everything. So next slide. And you could see this in the materiality. So even though this was a very large element, it was a translucent element within the space. Next slide. So you can see how this element began to occupy that courtyard and actually dominate that experience. Next slide. Going to start picking up now, yes. And so Mark's experimentations with the ceiling and the beadwork, it can be seen here. Next. And Chris's element in the courtyard, how it began to relate. And so my job was to understand how they came together, right? So the next slide again. And how this could appear from the subway. Next slide. And from the street. We're going to go now like this. Okay. So I would oh, this is a little fast now. But what I in turn in trying to bring these two together was looking at what the landscape is. And in essence, you know, we started the conversation earlier about the sense of earth and how an interior and exterior connection is made literally through the floor. And so in the earlier images, you saw sort of Lenape construction materiality and earth materiality to come to the form of addressing the opportunity to restore the interred to the site. So, and we'll do this very, very quickly. I'm sorry, Peggy. So with the idea and the debate that Peggy had and I have about mounding, we actually began to explore this in terms of clay and fluidity. Next slide. And so within that courtyard, what this element could be in terms of being a place of repose and reposition, but also with the idea that the earth splits open to tell this story. So next slide. Within the context of, again, Chris's sculpture, how the reinterment can be staged, and next, and we're almost there, right? And how the space just begins to feel to the community itself. And with that, I will drop the mic.
I'm so sorry. I mean, that is such a jewel to me. Thank you. I mean, I guess we have no time for questions. We're all done. Okay.
Or no questions.
I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you to our panelists. This conversation, I could listen to you guys for 4 more hours. We could go into the late night. This was a really great conversation that I hope we can continue. And thank you all for coming. Please, when you leave, take a survey.